Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosemary Keene. I'm the Communications Specialist with the Soybean Innovation Lab. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Focus Groups 101, a brief guide to conducting focus groups in village settings, presented by Kathleen Ragsdale and Mary Reed Wahidi with the Social Science Research Center at Mississippi State University. If this is your first time with us or at one of our webinars, just to give you a bit of background on SIL, the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for the Soybean Value Chain Research, the Soybean Innovation Lab, is the United States Agency for International Development's only comprehensive program dedicated to soybean research for development. SIL is building a foundation for soybean production in Africa by developing the knowledge, innovation, and technologies to enable successful soybean production. This morning with us, our presenters are Dr. Kathleen Ragsdale. She leads the Feed the Future Soybean Innovation Lab's Socioeconomic and Gender Equity Research Team. Kathleen is an Associate Research Professor at the Social Science Research Center of Mississippi State University. Dr. Mary Reed Wahidi co-leads the Feed the Future Soybean Innovation Lab's Socioeconomic and Gender Research Team, and Mary is an Assistant Research Professor at the Social Science Research Center of Mississippi State University. Excuse me. Here you can see more information on our presenters. To begin our webinar today, I'd like to take a quick pre-test of our attendees, and I'll be launching these polls one after the other, and you will have 30 seconds to respond to each. This is just to gauge your understanding of, and basic understanding and background knowledge of what we use focus groups for, and kind of the basic format and these limitations or features of focus groups. So I'll be launching poll number 1 right now. You'll have 30 seconds to respond. Get your answers in, we're wrapping up. Great. And this is what we were able to share today. We'll get to more of these answers and more of these questions throughout the poll today. Our second poll, I'll launch just here, is the recommended minimal length of focus groups is 30 minutes. Once again, you'll have about 30 seconds for this, and then I will close it. Great. And once again, we will bring these answers up later, and we'll be able to discuss them after Kathleen and Mary share with us their webinar today. And our last pre-test question, good focus group questions are not open-ended. I'll be launching that right now, and you'll have 30 seconds. And lastly, there we are. So launching into our webinar today, we'll start with Kathleen. Good morning, Kathleen. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. And thank you guys so much for joining our webinar. We're really excited to be here. And I was talking with Rose earlier, and I said I'm kind of embarrassed to call this a brief because the manual, which we're going to provide to you after the focus group, it's like 80-something pages. But then Rose mentioned that she actually took a whole course on focus groups, so I'm feeling better about this. So I'm going to jump right into answering the question, what are focus groups? So focus groups are group interviews that provide insights into how people think about a specific topic. They can be formal, that is highly planned and structured group discussions, or they can be impromptu or informal, and that means a spontaneous group discussion. They typically last 1 to 2 hours, and they include 6 to 12 people and use convenience or purposive sampling. And we're actually going to skip over the sampling issues because we actually have that in the manual for you. So we can go to the next slide now. Why focus groups? Focus groups are an efficient way to capture detailed information from several local experts at one time. Focus groups are cost-effective alternative to conducting numerous in-depth interviews with individuals. And results from several focus groups can be compared across the same topic to identify similarities and differences in knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. So focus groups are led by a moderator, who some people also call a facilitator, and the note taker assists the moderator by taking detailed notes, by ensuring that the recording equipment is working properly, and with other tasks such as helping to man the visual aid and the flip chart and stuff like that. So effective moderators and note takers both need excellent interpersonal skills. They need to be friendly, polite, and professional, and they need to be able to establish rapport and encourage participation. And they actually have to do this at the same time while still ensuring that the discussion moves forward and stays on track. So managing time in a focus group is actually very important, and that's where the teamwork of the moderator and the moderator and the note taker is really important. So here's an important tip, and we've actually put a couple of these throughout the presentation for you. So if you're new to conducting focus groups, keep in mind that smaller focus groups of about 6 people are much easier to manage than our larger groups about 12 people. So just when you're starting out, just take it a little bit easier on yourself if you can. So the basic tools that you need for focus groups include recording equipment, which can be as simple as your smartphone. In fact, I always use my smartphone as a backup, or an audio recorder. You also will need writing pad and pens for the moderator and the note taker, any visual aids you might need, flip charts and markers for the flip charts. And last but not least, you're going to need your discussion guide. And don't forget to take 1 to 2 copies of your discussion guide for everyone, including the moderator, the note taker, and the translator if you're using one. So in this photo, this is Gabriel Ayachim, who's in the foreground, and Zakaria Waher, and they are of Ghana's Savannah Agricultural Research Institute, or SARI, and they actually helped us with moderating and translating this focus group. And in the far corner on the right of the screen, you see that they're holding up a visual aid, and this is a soybean success kit bag. And which was used as this aid during this focus group with women soybean farmers on cultivating and cooking with soy. So the soybean success kits were starter packs for soybean production distributed by SIL between 2014 and 2016. So we went back to Ghana in 2015, and this was actually a focus group with women farmers who we wanted to find out how they were the issues around growing soy, and also were they cooking soy for the family. So now I'm going to turn things over to Mary, who'll be talking about how to develop your discussion guide.
Good morning. Just jumping in front of Mary, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention earlier, if you have any questions for Kathleen or Mary throughout the duration of this webinar, please feel free to use the chat and the questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel. It's typically on the right side of your screen unless you've moved it. If you just use the arrow and open that screen out, you'll be able to type in your questions, and we've got a whole team here ready to take those questions, and then we'll go over them at the end in a Q&A. Sorry, Mary, for interrupting. Please go ahead.
No problem. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay, so I'm going to be walking through the discussion guide with you. Let me just wait. Looks like we need to pull it back up to the full view. Okay, jump ahead one slide, please, Rose. Okay, great. So as Kathleen said, it's important that, especially with formal focus groups, you have a discussion guide. And I'm going to walk through 6 key features that you would like to put in your focus guide. Think of this as a roadmap that you'll create to keep you on track and make sure you cover everything you want to cover in your focus group. The discussion guides typically include your research objectives, that's what you want to accomplish, the participant profile, who are the local experts you'll be seeking to participate in the focus group, the logistics, when and where your focus group will take place, the introduction script, which provides your participants with a little background info on you, the ground rules, and if you have time, a culturally tailored icebreaker to help participants get warmed up. The 5th thing is the all-important research question script, and that includes the specific questions you want to ask. And 6 is your wrap-up. This is a simple closing statement to end the focus group and thank your participants for their time. Now let's go step by step through these 6 areas. Part 1 of the discussion guide is focus on research objectives. Remember that focus groups typically last 2 hours. That may sound like a lot of time, but it will go by really fast. So you can only address a few topics during your focus group. First, ask yourself what problems or needs your focus group should address. For example, do you want to know whether a new technical training is equally effective for men and women farmers? Or you may want to better understand why an infant feeding program works well in some communities but not in others. Part 2 is your participants' profiles. Focus groups are ideally conducted with 6 to 12 members who share some similar characteristics that directly relate to your research objectives. Examples would include gender, age range, or social status. So try also to match the moderator and note taker with participants if it's possible. And this is especially important when you're discussing sensitive topics. For example, don't invite the village chief to be in the same focus group as subordinates, as this can impact group dynamics. For this focus group you see in the photo, we interviewed, this was about gender equity and land tenure in northern Ghana. So for this focus group, it was important to conduct separate groups with men and women soybean farmers because topics like gender and land allocation can be rather sensitive. In this ICT for Ag-D focus group with soybean farmers in Ghana, MOFA Extension Agent Red Al-Hassan, you see him in the blue shirt in the foreground, served as our moderator and our translator. Kathleen was also moderating and taking notes and photos. She's not pictured though. And then if you look in the center of the photo, you see Emmanuel Osei Minsa from Catholic Relief Services. And you see his laptop out. He was serving as the note taker.
Great. I'm
So
going to go. Sorry, go ahead, Mary. I apologize.
I was just going to introduce Rose and the next poll.
Great. I will launch this now. I'll give you about 30 to 40 seconds to answer this one based on the information that Kathleen and Mary have provided so far. I'll be wrapping up the poll now in just a few seconds. And here are our results.
Thank you, Rose. So with that answer, that one we can discuss now, and the majority of you got it right. It was all of the above. Like I just said, you want to consider gender, age range, and social status. The third part of your discussion guide is about logistics. Logistics include where the focus group will take place. So make sure you have proper permissions, and that, for example, that may include from the village chief or village elders. Make sure you conduct community mobilization to ensure community members are receptive to participate. Logistics also include when the focus group will take place. Some things to keep in mind: avoid scheduling focus groups during peak harvest times, on market days, or during special holidays. Also, choose a time of day that works best for your participants. Pay close attention to things like women's duties such as food prep and childcare. Now let's talk briefly about community mobilization. Community mobilization is a multi-step process to identify communities receptive to working with you. The first step is to contact the community's gatekeepers. In village settings, this may include the village chief, village elders, or other key community leaders. In other settings, the gatekeepers may include local religious leaders, organization heads, and other community leaders. And we talk a little bit more in depth about community mobilization in the manual that Kathleen mentioned at the beginning. In this photo, we see Gabrielle Achim and Zach Wahor of Sari serving as translators during our meeting in northern Ghana with the village chief to introduce our Soybean Innovation Lab project and to ask his permission to conduct focus groups. Another example of community mobilization, here we see Kathleen and Sheila Asimbi Yaboa of Catholic Relief Services. They are visiting a village to introduce the Soybean Innovation Lab project and research team to the community and to ask village members if they would be receptive to participating. And another example here, we see our SIL enumeration team leader, Al Hassan Idrisu, there in the center, reintroducing the SIL research team to a community and asking if village members would like to participate in the focus group. Part 4 of your discussion guide is focused on the introduction script. Your introduction is important as it sets the tone for the entire focus group and starts building rapport. Start by introducing yourself and the note taker to your participants. Tell your participants the purpose of the focus group, including that their answers will be used for research and will be recorded to ensure accuracy, that their responses will remain confidential, and that their names will not be used in any publications or reports. Also, go over the estimated time the focus group will take, go over what your participants will be doing, remind your participants of any incentives that you may be giving out. A quick note about informed consent. Depending on your organization or institution, you may need to get informed consent from participants before you conduct formal focus groups. Formal focus groups may require organizational approval from the Institutional Review Board or IRB in order to publish your results in peer-reviewed journals. Results from informal focus groups that are only going to be used for your knowledge may not require you to go through formal channels for conducting human subjects research. So here are the simple ground rules that we like to use in our focus groups. And we always modify these to be culturally appropriate for the different types of participants, depending on our audience. It's important, rule number 1, it's important to us that everyone gets a chance to speak during our focus group today. Number 2, because we care about your opinions, we will try to use our discussion guide to make sure we cover everything. Number 3, because everyone's words are important to us, please make sure only one person speaks at a time. And number 4, respect each other's privacy after the focus group ends. For example, we like to say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. A classic way to build rapport is to use an icebreaker, although it's going to depend on your group of participants and the amount of time you have as to whether you decide to use an icebreaker. When planning an icebreaker, make sure it's culturally relevant and age appropriate and that it won't eat up a lot of time. A quick icebreaker that seems to work for a variety of groups is a simple and fun question like, if you could be any animal, tell us what animal you'd be and why. Or you can pose a question that relates to the focus group topic, such as, who did you talk to the first time you used a cell phone? Or what kind of soy foods do you prefer? Another technique is to answer the icebreaker question yourself to kick off the group responses, and it helps participants get warmed up. By answering the question yourself, you give an opportunity for a little bit of self-disclosure, and it helps participants warm up to the idea of speaking to you. The fifth part of the discussion guide is the all-important set of research questions. So good focus group questions are open-ended, and they try to avoid yes and no responses. Instead, they ask things like who, what, when, where, why, and how. Open-ended questions provide rich information, which is one of the advantages of focus groups over surveys. A good focus group question is also conversational. They use words participants would normally use when talking about a topic, and they're easy to say out loud. Good focus group questions also avoid using acronyms and technical terms your participants may not understand. And what if a participant uses an acronym or a technical term? You should ask them to explain to the group to ensure that everyone is on the same page. Good focus group questions are clear. When you ask the question, your participants should understand exactly what you're asking them. And good focus group questions are also usually short. A lengthy question can confuse participants. So here's another tip. Divide lengthy or complex questions into 2 or more short questions. For example, let's take the question, how do you get your soybean crop to market to sell, and who do you sell it to at the market? So this question could actually be turned into 4 short questions. The first question would simply be, how many of you sell part of your soybean crop? And for those who say that they sold the crop, you would ask them, where do you sell your soybean crop? How do you get your crop to the market? And who do you sell your crop to at the market? Another tip, before you finalize your questions, first, make sure each question relates to the objective. If not, omit it. Remember that your time is limited, and also your participants' time is valuable, so make sure you don't ask unnecessary questions. Number 2, read your questions out loud to make sure they're easy to say. Sometimes a written question doesn't sound clear when you say it out loud to others.
And now I'm going to be launching the webinar's post-test polls. These are the same questions that you saw at the start of the webinar before we heard from Kathleen and Mary on the different features of focus groups and their recommended lengths and their recommended minimal sizes. So after each of these questions, I'd like to invite Kathleen or Mary to just give a quick summary about, again, what you had mentioned. And just a reminder for our participants today as well, this webinar will be recorded. All of these results will be shared from the pre-test and the post-test. I'll also be sharing that handbook that Kathleen and Mary were talking about. And all of this, again, will be available on our website, and you will receive a link about it. If you're wondering if you can't access these polls or if you think the results have gone away too quickly, don't worry, you will be able to see them later. But now for the first post-test question, I'm launching that now. Closing the poll. And here are our answers. Seems like everyone got it this time. Our second question, launching now. Closing this poll in a few seconds. And here are our results. Kathleen or Mary, is there anything you wanted to comment on here?
Hi, this is Mary. Let's go through the third one, and I'll make a comment about all three of them.
Great, thank you. Launching the third one now. Closing this poll in a few seconds. And here are our results.
Okay, thank you very much, Rose. So looking at the answers, everyone, for the most part, is pretty knowledgeable about focus groups. Let me just run through these real quickly, why the answers are what they are. So the recommended minimal size of the focus group is 6 people. That's true. You want to keep in mind that for a focus group discussion, you want to have a good number of people, 6 being the fewest. You can go up to 12, and also think about inviting more people because you don't know who's going to show up. And as Kathleen will talk about soon, personalities are different. So you may have some people that are more open to talking and some that are a little quieter. So you want to make sure you've got a good group of people, a good size. The second one, the recommended minimal length of a focus group is 30 minutes. The polling results were a little more unclear about that. So this is actually false. The reason being that focus groups can take a lot of time. You want to aim for 1 to 2 hours, and you will see that you could quickly go over your time if you're not careful and structured. And that's one of the reasons that we're talking about this focus group guide, the discussion guide. It helps you stay within that range. And if you have 6 to 12 people talking, it's most certainly going to take you more than 30 minutes to get through all of your questions. Third is the focus group questions are not open-ended. That's false. They should be open-ended. As I said, we want to avoid yes/no questions and get into those that elicit a rich discussion.
Great, and thank you, Mary. Speaking of rich discussion, if any of our attendees today have any questions, just reminding you again, we have the questions on the chat panel in your GoToWebinar control panel here, usually on the right side of your screen, unless you've moved it. So just feel free to collapse that arrow down and enter in any questions you have. We have people who are collecting the questions, and we'll be able to get to those in the Q&A session. So just a reminder. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rose. So the final part of the discussion guide is going to be your wrap-up, the focus group wrap-up. The wrap-up includes your closing questions. It includes recapping ground rules, thanking your participants, and distributing any incentives. These 2 questions should be asked at every close. Go ahead and write. Rose, I believe we're out of order there. Let me just back up for just a second. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Okay, so these two questions you see below should be asked at every close. Write them in your discussion guide. First, is there anything we missed that you'd like to talk about? And second, what is the most important point we've discussed? So why are these questions important? The first question, is there anything we missed that you'd like to talk about, can capture things you did not think about but may be important to participants. The second question, what's the most important point we discussed, clarifies what's important to participants. Also, you want to recap the ground rules about respecting fellow participants' privacy once the focus group has ended. You want to thank participants for their valuable time, and you want to distribute any incentives. Now I'm going to turn things back over to Kathleen, and she's going to talk about the moderator's skills and duties, among some other things.
Great, thanks so much. So, so what are the skills good moderators need, and what are their duties? We're going to be talking about that now. So, next slide, please. So, as a moderator, you're going to need to be skilled at asking questions, encouraging all participants to respond, probing for further information, and searching for differences in responses, and in managing personalities. In fact, this managing personalities is a big issue in focus groups. So one of the tips we want to talk about is pauses. So when someone says something during a focus group, pause for 5 seconds or so to see if that person has more to say, or if another person wants to add feedback. And pauses give participants the opportunity to finish their thoughts, and basically opens up that space to allow participants to know that we're definitely listening to them. We want to know what they have to say. The next tip is on probing. So probes, if something is important to explore more fully, you can ask probe questions like, can you tell me more about that? Or can you give me an example? Probes help ensure that emerging information is fully explored. And remember that focus groups are kind of a fact-finding mission. So this is using pauses and probes are very important to getting all the information that you can elicit from participants. So another tip is that when you're practicing your questions, try putting emphasis on different words. Decide which delivery will best elicit responses. So an example would be, what agric knowledge do you need to grow better soy that you don't have now? Or what agric knowledge do you need to grow better soya that you don't have now? And this really, that kind of what do you not have now? And so it kind of gives some emphasis to what you're looking at. So now we're going to go to the next slide, and this is about managing personalities. So there are kind of 4 types of personalities in general that you can think about when you're doing focus groups. You're going to have experts who are actually individuals who know a great deal about the topic. And experts can sometimes either dominate the discussion, or they can become bored because they're just not very, engaged. And to help manage them, remind them of the value of getting everyone's input. Dominant talkers may not be true experts, but they may tend to interrupt others or to speak at great length. And to help manage them, or politely remind them that everyone's feedback is important. And then on the opposite spectrum of dominant talkers, you have the quiet types. And these are people who are generally more shy in nature and will not really interact much in focus groups. And for them, actually use eye contact again and positive statements to encourage them to engage, such as, I don't want to leave anyone out of the conversation. What do you think? And then finally, we have ramblers. And these may not be dominant talkers, but they can easily eat up precious time or take a discussion way off track. And that is actually something you have to be very aware of in focus groups, that your focus group can go off track easily. So to help manage ramblers, use gentle guiding statements to help them wrap it up, such as, we need to keep the discussion moving along, but can you tell me more about that after the focus group? And again, all of this stuff will be in the manual that we'll be sending out. So here's an example of soybean farmers participating in a Soybean Innovation Lab focus group on gender equity and land tenure. From this photo, you may surmise that these women may have very different personalities. So recognizing personality differences early in a focus group can help encourage full participation by all, because you're trying to kind of read your participants and kind of figure out very quickly what they're comfortable with. In addition, it's also important to pay attention to cultural norms around gender, around age range, and social status when conducting focus groups. And that's something that we talked about before, because someone might not be a quiet type in one group, but they would be more quiet in another group if they have less status in that group. And with focus groups, you also have to manage group dynamics. So from the start, the women soybean farmers participating in this ICT for Ag Development focus group, and ICT for Ag is Information Communication Technology for Agricultural Development. So it's ICT for Ag D. These focus group participants were very relaxed and talkative, and you can even see that from the picture. And also note the many infants and toddlers that are with their mothers in this picture. They're a reminder that when you're doing field work, there are always things going on around you that can distract you and your participants. So know your discussion guide and have a note taker ready to address distractions. Helps keep the focus group on track even when these distractions arise, which they inevitably will. Okay, next slide, please. So during this focus grouping, actually, if you contrast that to the previous group of women, these women soybean farmers were much less comfortable talking with the SIL team. This was further complicated when several men spontaneously decided to join the focus group and began to dominate the discussion. So you see the gentleman on the left of the screen, and he and a couple of men on the next to him started basically talking, and it was a very kind of a difficult situation because we wanted to get the women to talk, and they were much more reticent when the men joined. So we had to really let the women know that we wanted them to speak up and wanted them to participate. So early, and please next slide. Yeah, thank you. Early in the focus group, we learned that the woman in the left photo produces and sells soy kebabs at the local market. So we commissioned her to prepare a big batch for the group, a gesture that was much appreciated by these participants. So everyone got to eat some kebabs. And as you can see, this was a great way to break the ice with this group. And we later learned that most of these focus group members had never had the opportunities to sample soy kebabs. And so it was a very important part of just finding out some more information about what was going on in terms of cultivating soy and producing soy for the household and for market. So next slide, please. So is the aim of focus group is to gather data and not reach consensus. And that's really important because sometimes when you get into group dynamics, people think that you're wanting to reach consensus, and that's not the aim. So as a moderator, it's important to remember that you need to be objective, which means you need to be non-judgmental in order to ensure different participants' perspectives can be shared. You need to be approving enough to put participants at ease, but not affirming of any particular perspective. So this is actually very important. And next slide. So as the moderator, your goal is to facilitate the generation of useful information during the focus group. So as the moderator, you should really know your discussion guide very well. We keep saying that, know your discussion guide, know your discussion guide. That's like one of the take-home points because this is so important. If you are prepared, you're going to have a much better focus group, and your participants are going to have a much more enjoyable time. So practice saying each question out loud before the session, before the session, so you don't stumble over your words. And actually, that's a good example because I actually have a trouble saying session, and I always have to practice it beforehand. So next slide, please. So as the moderator, you should first Allow participants a few minutes to carefully consider their answers. And then next, facilitate discussion around participants' answers. And finally, carefully reflect back a summary of what you heard and ask participants if you got it right. Because what's really interesting with focus groups, what is the old saying, what you heard was not necessarily what I said. And that's very much in keeping with the idea about focus groups of always reflecting back. So next for this tip, the moderator's goal is to ensure even participation. But what if 1 or 2 people are dominating the discussion? Your first step should be to thank them for their feedback and to call on others. Next, you can go, and this is kind of like going from, the most gentle to more firm approaches. So first, thank them, call on others. The second, you can take a roundtable approach and you actually go in one direction around the group and give each person time to answer. And this way, everyone is assured of full participation. And then if the domination persists, you can thank them again and just continue to call on others. So this is, this is part of these interpersonal skills of how it's important to deal with your focus group participants so that no one feels alienated and everybody is participating fully. So in terms of note takers' duties, we're going to talk about this briefly now. As a note taker, your duties are also to be very familiar with the discussion guide. And in fact, this is important because sometimes a note taker has to take over and become the moderator. And for whatever reason, this can happen. Always be ready for these kinds of things when you're doing field work. So it's also important that the note taker keeps track of time and keeps the moderator on track. Because in the heat of a discussion that's very compelling, the moderator can lose track of time. So it's that note taker can really be a good help in that part. Also, taking good notes is one of the key duties of the note taker. So what you can look for is you can capture themes that are emerging in the group. You can talk about body language and key points held by the majority of participants and by key points held by the minority. So what's kind of the majority ideas, and then what are some of the people that say, no, I don't agree with that. It's also really great for the note taker to capture these noteworthy quotes that are going to really resonate with what your research objectives are. The note taker is also going to be responsible for operating any recording equipment that you use and manning the flip chart or the visual aids. The note taker, as we mentioned earlier, can also respond to unexpected interruptions or problems. So these distractions that can arise in focus groups. So moderating a note taker may require you to stay focused for a long period of time. And again, this is one of the things of being ready for the unexpected in field work. So here we conducted a focus group on gender equity and land tenure with women soybean farmers that lasted 1.5 hours. And next slide, please. Then, and you can see in the background, like these are it's the same village. So unexpectedly, we had to immediately conduct the men's focus group in that same village. So being ready for this unexpected turn of events allowed the Soybean Innovation Lab team to collect useful information despite the mental fatigue of conducting 2 focus groups back to back in a 3-hour period. So again, this is part where you have to be prepared to roll with the punches and whatever's happening in the field. And when I say in the field, that can be, in an organization in New York City or a village in northern Ghana. So what are the final steps before conducting your focus groups? And these are the preparation things. So you've identified your major goal in the focus group. You develop your discussion guide to achieve this goal. And now it's time to plan your focus group. So recruit potential participants, and you will always need to over-invite because a lot of people, things will come up, they won't be able to attend or they might forget. So if possible, send a follow-up invitation with the focus group's time and place so that your participants will know that this is coming up. So, in a perfect world, what you try to do is 3 days prior to the focus group, contact all participants to remind them to attend. Of course, when you're doing work in very rural and remote areas, this is not always going to be possible, and that's where you have to rely on the liaisons that are helping you with community mobilization to make sure that you get people to attend. And again, in a perfect world, contact them 1 day prior to the focus group to remind them. So in terms of scheduling, plan the focus group to be about 90 minutes, so about an hour and a half. And in terms of setting, whenever possible, hold sessions in a room or area with adequate airflow, lighting, and privacy from other community members. But you also know when you're doing work in rural and remote settings that the idea about privacy is very different, and you might have people kind of, joining focus groups, as I talked about with the men that joined the women soybean farmers focus group, because they were like, oh, this looks interesting, and I'm interested in what they're talking about, so I'll just go and hang out too. And that's, again, gets to the fact that these kinds of things are unexpected and can be hard to control in village settings. So in terms of final prep, make sure you have your voice recorder, your writing pads, pens, visual aid, flip chart, everything that you need. And I always make a list of those things and make sure I have everything on my list. And for a voice recorder, I actually now, when I'm doing work in the field, I actually use my cell phone for the voice recorder, and it's very helpful. So recording equipment should be tested. Okay, could you please go back one? Thank you. Recording equipment should be tested and retested prior to the focus group. You will not be able to write everything down as quickly as you want to, so you really need to record the sessions. And if you're using a smartphone to record, have a portable phone charger on hand, because you could run out of battery. For digital voice recorders, have fresh batteries on hand and use your smartphone as a backup. So in terms of final preparation, again, this is prepare, prepare, prepare. So know your discussion guide and practice those questions out loud. Your participants may ask questions concerning the focus group's context or content, so be prepared to answer them. And if possible, remind participants 1 day prior to the focus group, and the moderator and note taker should arrive early to set up. Immediately after the focus group, the moderator and the note taker should write up their notes. And again, this isn't always possible when you're working in rural and remote areas, because oftentimes you have to, load up and go on to the next village or to do whatever you're doing in the project. So, but in the best case scenario, the moderator and the note taker should be writing up their notes immediately after the end of the focus group. And if not, just try to wait until and do that evening when you have a little bit of downtime. So we also want to just talk a little bit about spot transcription. And spot transcription is a quick and cost-effective way to analyze a large amount of data. So basically, you're listening to the recording and you're taking notes about what are the really good quotes that are getting to the points that you're looking at. So you know where you found your supporting quotes and include pertinent participant details. For example, the gender of the person. So if you're doing focus groups on with men farmers and women farmers and gender equity and land tenure, you want to make sure when you are capturing your quotes with spot transcription that you're making a note of whether, is this the men speaking or the woman? And you'll realize that this sounds very simplistic, but it's one of the things that people actually sometimes forget to do, and then you have to go back and find that information again. And of course, you don't want to have to go digging for it. So here are some references and some additional resources that Mary and I put together. And we want to thank you for your time and really appreciate you attending our webinar. And I'm going to turn the things back over to Rose.
Great. Thank you again, Kathleen and Mary. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us. At this point, I'd like to introduce our Director Pete Goldsmith to discuss and moderate some of the questions that our participants have offered, and maybe Kathleen and Mary, you can share some of your thoughts on these. And if we run out of time today for these questions, don't worry, we will make sure that we get all of these answered offline, and these questions and answers will be circulated to all the attendees with those other materials that I talked about. So Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Rose. What a great webinar, Mary and Kathleen. There are a number of questions, so we'll have to be as brief as we can. The first question comes from Margaret Hedgewood, a Purdue engineering student, and she asks, if your moderator translator is male and you want to conduct a focus group comprised of all women, would this be a problem? I'm a female and will be acting as a note taker, but the only translator available during my visit is male.
Kathleen here. That's a great question, Margaret. And, you know, this is one of the things that when you're doing field work in rural and remote areas where you do not speak the language, you just have to do the best that you can. And so sometimes you have to use a moderator, a translator/moderator who is of the opposite gender when you would prefer someone of the same gender. So for example, with Red Al-Hassan, the MOFA extension agent who was our moderator and translator, he conducted all the focus groups, which were conducted separately among men and women, for the ICT for Ag Development focus groups, because he was the person that spoke that language and was available and willing to help. So then, interestingly, for the gender equity and land tenure focus groups, the one that we gave the pictures of, where we did the back-to-back focus groups for 3 hours, that moderator translator was actually a young woman who was able to participate. So sometimes you just have to go with what you have, and in a perfect world, you would match people on gender. But it was very interesting because a couple years ago when we were doing one of our big surveys, one of our enumerators was a young woman, and we were asking the women to survey other women and the men to survey men. And she and her partner, who was a male, they asked if they could trade because she was so young that was actually causing a bit of a problem with getting information from these older women, because it was kind of messing with the age, rank, and social status things. So we actually allowed them to switch in that instance, because they're the local experts on their culture, and they knew that it was an issue, and so they just changed. So this is the thing with focus groups and doing any kind of research. You just have to think on your feet and roll with the punches. So great question, Margaret. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. Our second question comes from Dennis Musa from Malawi. He's with the aid organization GIZ. Dennis asks, he would like to know how one could balance the audience social status when you're trying to probe and generate information on wealth ranking without offending some or making others maybe not tell the complete truth about their status.
Hi, this is Mary. Dennis, that's a very good question. And I will give a little insight, and I think Kathleen might have something to add too. But in general, that's sort of something that you want to think out when you're developing your focus group guide. So it's really about thinking through your questions and asking the right questions that are going to make your audience feel comfortable and open to talking. I think in that, something that could be sensitive, like wealth ranking, you may want to really consider your audience, if it's possible, to control your participants, who you invite. And I would also add, like I said, you really want to think about your question, and the moderator should also be expecting to jump in and work around anything that could be uncomfortable and smooth things over.
Great. And so Kathleen here, I just wanted to build on what Mary said also. It's very important too to to pay attention to the fact that sometimes some things are not going to be very good focus groups. They need to be more one-on-one, in-depth interviews. If you're really looking at like super sensitive topics like wealth within a village, you know, I think most people in any kind of setting, no matter what their social status, what their educational level, if you get a bunch of people who are in a group and know each other, they're probably not going to want to talk too much about their salaries or you know, how much they have in their 401k or anything like that. So so really think about, are you going to be able to use a focus group? Is this the best tool to get at the information that you're actually wanting to get at? So sometimes you're going to have to go ahead and really think about how you pose the questions. You know, what are the questions, how they're posed, and are you going to need to use like an in-depth interview or a survey versus a focus group, because that's going to actually give you the better information.
Super. Thank you, Mary and Kathleen. I know we have 4 minutes left. I'll leave it to the organizers on whether we have a hard stop in 4 minutes or roll over. But the next question comes from Katie Van Ness, who is with the Feed the Children program. She asks, is there a culturally appropriate way to ask the men to leave so the women feel more comfortable?
Katie, that's a very great question. I mean, to me, this is Mary. To me, I think it depends on the culture that you're in. There should be a culturally appropriate way to do that. And I think that that's, like I said, you've got to understand the culture you're dealing with. In some cultures, it's not a big deal. You just simply ask it politely. And what do you think, Kathleen? Do you have any other insight on that?
Yeah, and a great question, Katie. So I would say that also this is where if you have a translator who's actually helping moderate, they can really help to guide and set the tone, and you as the moderator and the note taker, as being the outsiders coming into conducting the focus group, you're really helping to set the tone. So I would say, you always do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat people well, be polite to them, and sometimes approach it with a bit of humor if you can, or just smile and just say, oh, I'm so sorry, we really need to get the information from the women farmers. We'll be conducting focus groups with men farmers later, and we would love to have you participate in that. So in that instance where we had the gentleman just come into this informal focus group that we were conducting, we just made sure we didn't say go away, because that would have actually been perceived as being bossy and rude, and could have unintended consequences for the women farmers later. We might make some of the men upset, and that's the last thing you want to do. So what we chose to do is we just said, oh, thank you, please, what you're saying is important to us, but we really want to hear from our women farmers on this one. So just kind of holding the line on that with grace and aplomb.
Yeah, thank you, Kathleen. Yeah, definitely a good question. Our next question comes from Fiona Mwaniki, and Fiona's with the Kilimo Media International, and she's based in Kenya. Fiona asks, how would you manage focus groups that elicit attention from uninvited villagers who want to participate in the discussions? Maybe somewhat similar to the previous question.
Yeah. Oh, Mary, go ahead, please.
Sure, thanks. I was just building off of what you said. I think it is similar to the earlier question, but just adding that, simply explaining to the people that come in that, this particular focus group, for example, is for women farmers and their feedback about soy foods, and kind of explaining how I really need to get this particular knowledge from these particular people And we really do hope to do a different focus group that will include you or include everybody in the future.
Yes, and I think just to kind of add on that, it's also very important when you're thinking about different cultures and the topic. You know, sometimes you can have mixed groups, mixed gender, but sometimes it's better to have definitely separate men's groups and women's groups. So, for example, Mary and I have a Centers for Disease Control project on teen pregnancy prevention in the Mississippi Delta. And when we conducted our first set of teen focus groups, we had a mixed group of boys and girls who were between the ages of 13 to 18, because we actually wanted to get the kind of how young people are talking about issues around teen pregnancy prevention and sexual risk behavior in group settings. And so we actually were very cognizant of the fact that we wanted both boys and girls talking in the same room. But then in northern Ghana, where we're working, where there are some very, very I don't want to say strict, but very traditional ways of gender separated spheres. We always try to do our focus groups with men and women separately, because the power differential between men and women is so great. So we really shoot for that. And again, what we do if men want to drift in, we basically, you know, ask them to leave very, very politely, or you know, if that doesn't feel like the right thing to do, then we'll just say, you know, thank you, and please, we want to get the women's input. And what we found with our focus groups and our community mobilization, all of the things that we're doing, once women know they have the permission to speak, they will speak. But they have to actually be given that permission, whether it's from us or from our translator, and so that they know that that's okay, and then they're very comfortable with it. So that's how it works in northern Ghana. You know, it could be very different in Kenya.
Thanks, Kathleen. I think, Rose, I don't know if you were muted.
Yes. Sorry, I'm sorry I was muted. We'll be taking just a couple more questions, but then we'll be wrapping up. And like I mentioned earlier, we will be offering these questions and these answers and the perspectives that Kathleen and Mary have shared on those in a file to all of the participants as well. So if your question didn't get answered right here, that's okay. We will make sure that it gets answered, and we will make sure that you have that information.
Thanks, Rose. So why don't we just take two more questions? And Julie, is it Savane or Savan, asks a very practical, good question. She says, can you please explain further how the moderator and the note taker would use the flip chart during the focus group?
Hi, Julie. This is Mary. I'll jump in on this. We use the flip charts, the focus groups that Kathleen was speaking about with the teens in the Mississippi Delta. We used flip charts in that setting, and they just worked really brilliantly. So essentially, it allows you to kind of write some questions down and start to collect some yes or no answers that you would then follow up. It's a great way to track consensus. So if you're saying, you know, how do you prepare your soybean? What's your favorite soy food? Then you start to write down the responses. I think it keeps the group a little bit more engaged. And then it also gives you another source of data at the end. So not only do you have your notes, but you can kind of look back and start to say, oh, it's interesting that 5 people liked soy kebabs, and then 3 people said they hate soy kebab. They prefer another type of food. So that's one thing that you can do, is just kind of keep them engaged and start to track, like real-time tracking what people are saying. Even though they're just talking, you start to see, they see their responses being written on these flip charts. And I think it adds just another element to the focus group experience.
And also, just to add on that, in terms of the flip charts, it can work really well. It kind of depends on the group. So if you have a translator, then you're actually going to be asking that translator to do something else. And not all translators are going to be comfortable or ready to do that, because you're asking them to, to write on a flip chart. And then it also depends on whether you're working with very low literate groups or more literate groups. So if you're working with very low literate groups, then you can use visual aids. Those are very helpful, but a flip chart is not really going to be very useful in that situation. So again, it just depends on what you're trying to accomplish and who your participants are. Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, great. Our last question, sorry we have to cut off. There are a number of really, really good questions, but we'll have to address them offline as everyone needs to move about their day. Last question comes from an environmental engineering student at the University of Illinois, Diana Byrne. And Diana asks, my question is about the validity of using focus group discussions to gather quantitative data. Is it possible to report quantitative aspects such as the percentage of participant comments that related to a specific point? Or is it only qualitative data, or is only qualitative data appropriate when using focus groups for data collection?
Hey, Diana, Kathleen here. That's a great question. And I think, are you thinking about in terms of turning this into a technical report, or trying to turn this into a publication or a poster, or what are you thinking of? It kind of depends on where you want that data to go. So for example,
we don't have Diana on the line, so okay. Maybe just kind of compare and contrast those.
I will. So with if you're using like just very like simple quantification, what you can do is, if you can like keep tallies of, for example, how many people like soy kebabs versus Banku. And you can report that in your technical report or in your poster. For a publication, you can report that too. But in terms of, I mean, it's not going to be like a quantifiable kind of data that you get from a very large survey. It's just it's a different kind of a beast. So you can't really say you're not going to find significance between two groups or anything like that, but you can see interesting trends, and that's kind of the key to that. And I think it's very valuable to keep tallies on different things that you're interested in, depending on what your topic is. So again, it's sort of, you have to make use of, or just think about what you're trying to accomplish in the focus group. And if you do some quick tallies, what will that give you? What kind of knowledge or what kind of information is that going to give you that you can use further? So anything to add, Mary?
Yeah, that's great. I think you're right. I think the focus group keeping tallies, like we did with our ICT for AgD, we asked how many people use cell phones, and then we followed that up with discussions about cell phone usage. It was important to report how many people in the focus group actually had cell phones, just to contextualize what we were doing. I think another thing to keep in mind is triangulating the data. So you can go to the same village and you can collect a survey among a large sample. And then if you're writing a paper or a report, you use the focus group discussion, you use that as more of a qualitative information to support your quantitative data. So it doesn't have to be all captured in the same set at the same time. You can do a survey, and then you can discuss those survey results in light of the focus group responses.
Great. Well, thank you again so much, Mary and Kathleen. This was really great. Thank you so much for your perspective and your expertise again. And to all our participants that are here, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your interest and your time. And I would just like to say again, all of the materials from today, including the poll results, the questions, the guidebook that they spoke about, recording of this presentation, and the presentation files will be made available later. And I'd also like to just ask you, in that email, we've also got a follow-up webinar survey. So if you do have the time, it's very, very short, but it's just for us to know and for us to constantly improve on what we're offering. So if you could take that as well, that would be great. As well, shameless communications plug, please feel free to look us up online, soybeaninnovationlab.illinois.edu. We have a newsletter and digest. Please feel free to subscribe to those. We're active on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Flickr. We have tons of stuff that I'd love for you to see. I'd love for you to check out. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to anyone on the team. We'd love to hear from you, and hopefully we'll see you at a webinar coming up soon. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and thank you everyone who hosted, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.